And the only way you can know what it is you're talking about is if you have an informed debate and discussion about it. And at the time of the run-up to the Gulf War, you were only getting one side. You were getting Ken Cakewalk Edelman. You were getting Dick Cheney, they will be throwing flowers from the rooftops. You were getting Richard Pearl saying, boy, it'll just be, just a few days, we'll be in there. And in fact, none of them had been in the region. In fact, I debated Bill Kristol down in, of all places, Midland, Texas, home of the Bush family, home of Laura Bush, at the University of Texas Permian Basin campus. And during that debate, the moderator, Eleanor Clift, asked Bill, have you ever spent any time in the region? And Bill's response was classic. I've always believed that on-the-ground experience is highly overrated. And this debate pitted those like Bill Kristol against a few of us, like Brent Scowcroft, myself, Tony Zinni, who had been Central Commander and had been involved in the first Gulf War, who actually had some on-the-ground experience. And what we wanted to make sure for the American people, I, in fact, even went on Fox News. I did Bill O'Reilly a couple of times. I did Hannity and Combs 3 times until the one time we just got so livid at Hannity that Valerie said, don't bother doing that one again. And I said to him, Sean was making some asshole remark. And I said to him, Sean, I've read your CV, and frankly, you're a little bit light on substance to permit yourself to make that sort of a remark. So he got mad, and I got mad, and that was the end of our relationship. Sean, by the way, is a failed house painter from Santa Barbara. He got driven out of Santa Barbara many years ago. It was important for us to have this debate. And the issue was always, what is it that we want to accomplish? What are we trying to do in Iraq that is truly in our national security interest? Is regime change in Iraq in and of itself a U.S. national security interest? What is it in our contract with our service people, those who go out and fire the guns and fly the airplanes and drive the ships? What is it in our contract with them that says you will go out and change regimes because George Bush tells you to do so? Nothing. Our contract with our service people is to defend the United States against foreign enemies, not going out searching for dragons to slay overseas. And that was the essence of the debate, and that's why I got back in the public square after 4 years in the private sector. Now, as it turns out, I had another small role to play in this particular drama, and that was calling my government to account for the lies that were uttered by George Bush in the State of the Union address in January 2003, and you've probably all heard the story. But if you haven't, let me just repeat the 16 words. The British government has learned that Saddam Hussein recently sought significant quantities of uranium from Africa. And why was that important? Because as Paul Wolfowitz said in his interview in Vanity Fair, which unfortunately is not nearly as often quoted as the picture of Valerie and me in Vanity Fair, but Paul Wolfowitz said in that interview, we settled on WMD because bureaucratically we could all agree upon it. Not because weapons of mass destruction were a real threat to the United States, but because bureaucratically the ideologues who took us into Iraq for the purposes of changing the political dynamics in the Middle East thought that the best way they could sell it to you, the American public, was by hyping the threat. We cannot afford to wait for the smoking gun to come in the form of the mushroom cloud. Remember hearing that? Regrettably, that was all made out of whole cloth. But it did the trick. As soon as they launched this publicity campaign, and Andy Card launched it in late August because, as he said, as a former auto executive, you never roll out the new brand before Labor Day. So they rolled out the brand and the new slogan in August, September timeframe of 2002, we cannot afford to wait for the smoking gun to come in the form of a mushroom cloud. And indeed, a mushroom cloud is the one weapon of mass destruction that provides a strategic threat to the sanctity of our system of governance. Chemical weapons are good terror weapons. They're decent tactical battlefield weapons if you're upwind when you release them. They're not so good if you're downwind. Biological weapons are good terror weapons. Haven't been proven to be good battlefield weapons, but they have the same problems and same characteristics of chemical weapons in that you don't want to be downwind when you release them. A nuclear weapon is that weapon which will fundamentally change the way we operate as a society. Don't take my word for it. Tommy Franks, shortly after he retired from the U.S. Army, was interviewed in one of my favorite magazines, Cigar Aficionado. You're all doctors here, so none of you probably read that. Maybe a few lawyers read it. Pauls or ex-Pauls, maybe the Speaker, Mr. Speaker, maybe you read it. In that interview, Tommy Franks said, if a nuclear weapon were to go off in the United States, it might mean that the U.S. military has to step in and take over governance of this great democracy of ours. 220 years of constitutional rule of civilian authority over the military, and you have a recently retired four-star general saying that if a nuclear weapon went off in the United States, he might have to step in and take charge of our governance. I find that positively appalling as a citizen and as a civilian who's exercised oversight over the military. But be that as it may, that is the nature of the threat, and that is the nature of the concern as it is perceived at senior levels of the government and as it was sold to the American people. Three components. Saddam Hussein is only a softball size worth of fissile material away from having a nuclear weapon. We have interdicted aluminum tubes that could be used for centrifuges to enrich uranium. And the British government has learned that Saddam Hussein recently sought yellow cake, that uranium that you would put in the centrifuges, from Africa. The problem was, anybody looking at the aluminum tube argument, I talked to somebody who was actually a nuclear scientist, a rocket scientist, who said to me that yes, these aluminum tubes were, one, of the wrong dimension, so they would have to be cut and adapted. And two, the dead giveaway was that they were very tightly machined to within tight tolerances, and they were anodized. In order to make them adaptable for use in centrifuges for the purposes of enriching uranium, the first thing you would have to do would be to remove the anodization. A pretty clear signal that perhaps these aluminum tubes had another function, which they did. They were the retrofitting of Italian-made artillery rockets.